Welcome to the session. It's an honor to be here and to moderate this panel today on energy literacy. We were just saying backstage, panel on literacy sounds like we should be just reading. And I assure you we won't be just reading today, but all of the people I'm talking to today have written interesting things that you can read and which I will recommend. Our first panelist is Marty Bent, the founder of TFTC.io media company, partner at 1031 VC and a director at Cathedra Bitcoin. Next panelist is Blake King, who's a power markets engineer for Galaxy, and the author of one of these things that I will recommend that everybody read, called Bitcoin Mining in the Grid on Brains. Mandatory reading if you're interested in this issue. And our next panelist is Guy Swann, the guy who has read more about Bitcoin than anyone else you know. An educator, narrator, filmmaker, entrepreneur, podcaster. And then there's me, Troy Cross. I'm a professor of philosophy and humanities at Reed College. I'm a fellow at the Bitcoin Policy Institute. Longtime Bitcoiner and someone who is just interested in this stuff and can't resist it. So thanks for coming. I want to start us out today by sort of establishing what we want to do on this panel. I think everybody here is probably well aware that that people inside the Bitcoin community and policymakers in DC and the media, particularly at the New York Times and the Guardian, but pretty much most major media outlets, much of academia and much of the energy world have a very, very different perspective on Bitcoin's energy use. I mean, a strikingly, shockingly different perspective. And the purpose of this panel is really try to close that gap rather than just kind of shouting across it, which is what always happens. And I think there's roughly two dimensions along which we differ. And of course, the Bitcoin community is not a monolith, and the media is not a monolith either. Pretty close, but I think there's like two dimensions of difference. One of which is normative. It's about our values. It's about how it strikes us when we hear that Bitcoin uses, let's say, between 1 and 2 thousandths of the world's primary energy, Bitcoin mining. For some people, that is a shocking and shameful statistic, and it's something that needs to be stopped. For other people, it's a rounding error. For other people, it's not nearly enough. And that is very striking. That's a normative difference. So is this a good thing or is it a bad thing? But then there are also just lots of factual differences. Like one person actually from Greenpeace told me, "You have your own set of facts." And I was like, no, there's only one set of facts. And you don't have them. And I do. That was my perspective. But there's another way of taking that phrase where it's really true. It's like there's a lot of stuff that we disagree about that's purely factual, and it shouldn't be that hard to settle. But for some reason, it is. So I want to kind of make headway on closing those gaps with these three experts today. I want to start with Guy. And Guy, I want to start with the normative question. How do you feel? Tell me about your feelings. When you hear that Bitcoin energy use is on the country scale, according to Cambridge, I checked this morning, somewhere between the Ukraine and Malaysia.
I think we can pump those numbers up. I think we can do a lot better than that. Bitcoin, like the reason Bitcoin uses energy is to provide something that nothing else can provide. And that's the arc of the development of human civilization, is the way to utilize energy sources to do things that we can't accomplish otherwise. Like a washing machine uses a lot more energy than hand washing your stuff in a creek, but it makes your it's a whole lot different quality of life when you have something that, when you can utilize energy that isn't your own in order to make your life better. Like, the use of energy is directly correlated to the flourishing of human life. And I think the idea of seeing any energy use out of context, but honestly in just a general sense, as a negative thing, is largely an anti-human value. It's to see anything that we do or some benefit that we can get for ourselves as something that's just negative, that we should feel guilty about. And obviously there's going to be plenty of things to compare and unravel in that, but I just think, like, from a fundamental framing, like, I don't see energy use as a bad thing, especially when Bitcoin can give us something that you genuinely cannot get with any other. You could spend an ungodly amount of energy in all of the alternatives for Bitcoin, and it doesn't do what Bitcoin does.
And can you just follow up on that and say what that thing is that Bitcoin does that you can't get without the energy? I think that's important.
Integrity in a monetary base without rulers, without any power structure, without any authority or hierarchy.
Marty, I want to turn this to you. I imagine you have opinions about energy use. I'm just taking a wild guess.
Yeah, I mean, in this particular example of people highlighting that Bitcoin's energy usage is on the scale of somewhere between Ukraine and Malaysia, it's just very, again, I think what Guy just said is very important, like a monetary system that has integrity and cannot be controlled by any one ruler. The powers that be do not like that they cannot control that, and so they find these weird ways. Like, I find it very odd that Bitcoin electricity use, Bitcoin mining electricity use gets singled out and used. These comparisons get used for Bitcoin and Bitcoin alone. Like, if you were to use the same comparison for washing machines or Christmas lights or data servers for AWS and Google Cloud, like, it would dwarf what Bitcoin does. But it's just, there's this weird argumentative framing that those who don't like Bitcoin force us into, which is like, oh, you have to compare Bitcoin's energy use to other countries, but nothing else. And it's just a very weird discriminatory tactic that is used to sort of isolate Bitcoin and then try to attack it from there. So, I mean, yeah, the energy use, like Guy said, is extremely important. We want to be developing more energy, consuming more energy, doing more productive things with that energy. That should be a good thing. Yes, we should do that as efficiently as possible with the least amount of pollution and the least amount of environmental disruption as possible. And that's the very ironic thing about how everybody attacks Bitcoin is Bitcoin literally makes us more energy efficient, makes sure we're polluting less and getting the most value out of the molecules that we turn into electrons to be productive with.
I think this is a thing I hear a lot. I'm sure you hear it too. Is yeah, Bitcoin, our energy use is good, provided it's providing something of human value. But Bitcoin is designed to waste energy. It's waste by design. And so in a way, while we can make other things, other uses of energy, we can make them more efficient. Let's say getting more computing cycles out of a given unit of energy. Bitcoin mining, because of the magical difficulty adjustment, cannot be made more efficient itself. If the ASICs get more efficient, we just use more power until we spend nearly a Bitcoin to mine a Bitcoin. How do you respond to this, Marty? That, like, efficiency is possible for everything in the world except Bitcoin.
Well, I would say run the numbers. If you look at the joules per terahash of how much energy it takes to produce SHA-256 cryptographic hash is used in Bitcoin mining, it's gone down significantly.
Way down.
Thousands of joules a terahash down. Top of the line is like 21 and a half joules per terahash. But on top of that, so I'm a co-founder of a mining company, Standard Bitcoin. We operate mainly in northern Tennessee, in southern Kentucky. And again, it's another ironic thing where they say Bitcoin is wasting energy. But really, what we see in this part of the country, in Appalachia, is what we target are cities with declining populations that had large manufacturing capacity that has since moved out due to Triffin's dilemma and the dollar's need to essentially hollow out our manufacturing base and send those jobs abroad so that we can have the US dollar reserve status. And it's very ironic because they're saying Bitcoin's wasting electricity, but the function of the dollar moving that manufacturing base elsewhere has left these stranded substations where they're forced to produce electricity of a certain amount, even though they don't have that demand anymore just because of the way the substation's built, and it's wasted. And we as Bitcoin miners are going out and noticing that waste, that excess capacity, and taking it up and actually providing economic value for the utility company. And the way it works in Tennessee with these utility co-ops is they have a mandate to keep prices low for residential consumers. And by Bitcoin miners coming in and consuming that excess capacity, that's providing the utility provider with more revenue, which allows them to keep rates lower for residents. So.
Okay, great. Now we're getting onto the fact side. And this is always what happens. Like I identified these two dimensions of difference, but they're interrelated because of beliefs about how using energy impacts everything else in the system. Blake, how do you deal with the, I'm sure you've had this conversation 1,000 times. And how do you deal with the claim that Bitcoin mining is inherently wasteful by design?
Yeah, I see this in a couple different ways. So a lot of times I see the kind of cognitive dissonance from, like you said, the New York Times article. I wanted to touch on that. They'll put out an article that's entirely prefaced by assuming Bitcoin is wasteful. They use all this electricity, and then they'll do another one on the energy transition where there's so many solar and wind things coming online. And it's like, how are we going to pay for this? What load is going to be available to consume this electricity and power these generators? The generators don't really know. They are looking at it and saying, okay, how are we going to, we're making an assumption on price, and then proponents will say, oh, we'll solve it with hydrogen or, ammonia or concrete or storage or something. These are all very expensive. These are out-of-market solutions. They need subsidies. And then Bitcoin miners come along with a product that's inherently valuable, inherently flexible, and willing to turn off when prices are high. And all of a sudden now it's become a cultural signal almost to claim that it's wasteful. It's no longer, they're not even really open-minded or entertaining. I've talked to people that say, oh, we've got a wind farm. We were thinking about hooking up refrigerators to it just for negative pricing, And I'm like, well, why don't you do Bitcoin mining? And they laugh. They say, oh, Bitcoin mining, it's so wasteful. And it's like, well, you just, like it's kind of
going to be great there.
Yeah, it's kind of tongue-in-cheek, but for some people it is like a, almost like a signal of pride to claim that it's wasteful. And it's like, no, this is a market solution, and this is a point in electricity in general, which is, are you willing to accept a free market solution to the problem of power? Or are you more vertically integrated where you have, like what Marty said, a utility that collects its costs and pass them on and depreciate substations, and those utilities take a risk. Like you said, you've got a factory coming into town and they only put up so much money for the substation, so you're betting that they're going to be here for 10 years. And when they skip shop, then that cost gets spread out among the rate base. And that's a real concern from utilities, and it's something that I think Bitcoin miners will solve for them, but I think they're suspicious. I think they're suspicious of fly-by-night miners coming in, and it's going to take some years to really build those relationships and show, hey, look, I can come with volume, and I can really actually help your rate base and lower your costs and help you depreciate these assets. But I think it'll take time to build trust.
Yeah, you mentioned something there that maybe the other two panelists want to riff on, because you mentioned markets just in passing as a way of just clarifying two different structures of electricity pricing. But more generally, the argument for waste seems to assume that Bitcoin itself is not valuable, right?
It's just a judgment of Bitcoin. It's just them saying that I don't like Bitcoin, therefore you shouldn't use energy on it. And I think one huge disconnect, actually there's probably two major disconnects that I'd see from kind of maybe the more political conversation standpoint, is if you don't know anything about money, then you're not going to understand why Bitcoin's valuable. And even trying to make sense of how and why it works the way it does. Like if you don't understand the ins and outs of monetary goods, of monetary history, and why one money can, like money makes or breaks society, literally. One of the most fascinating things in uncovering the kind of history and the things that both the cypherpunks, but more generally Bitcoiners have just gone down this crazy rabbit hole, that I think all that we talk about and like the history that we dive into of like kings and queens and policies and democracy and all of these things, I think there is a far clearer story of history that is the growth and failure of money that is what dictates the trends of these societies and the ultimate collapse. Like the Roman Empire collapsed because of debt. Like it's like, okay, it doesn't really matter who the Caesar was. It doesn't matter who was in charge. Like, and it doesn't matter exactly when the riot was or the war was. If you have an insurmountable debt because you have a broken money that has built up this 90-year negative feedback, then it's just going to end. The story of how it ends is kind of interesting, but it's not the story of why. And so if you don't understand why money is valuable, you can't possibly, and the chasm for the average person as to what money is, why it matters, and what makes a good money versus a bad money, the ignorance around that subject, without trying to be insulting, is horrifying.
Right. So just to summarize some of what we've said so far, one of the normative differences between Bitcoiners and the critics on energy are, well, Bitcoiners, surprise, surprise, think Bitcoin is valuable. And they have some critiques of mine.
Shock.
So they think energy spent is securing this network is well spent. Another is that they think markets actually decide how best to spend energy. And markets are an expression of subjective value. And the collective subjective values work themselves out in an auction for power. And another is I guess, the norm of energy use generally, where Bitcoiners tend to think that's a good thing, and energy being used correlates with all sorts of human flourishing. Okay, that's on the normative side. I don't know. These are probably familiar points, but they're worth rehearsing because it's hard to get into the factual stuff when people don't recognize the value of Bitcoin at all. I want to go back to Blake on, I think Blake has a different vision of how grids work and operate than most people do. And the critics especially. I think a lot of the critics, at least the popular critics in the press, well, they've got electricity in their heads as this, segmented thing where there are good forms of electricity, there are bad forms of electricity, and they think of, I guess, electricity consumption in moralized terms. Tell us how you think systemically of energy systems, Blake, and Bitcoin's role in the grid largely. Like, what kind of role do you think it plays in the grid? What do you think, I guess let me put the question this way, make more specific. What do you think people are getting wrong when they come at Bitcoin like it's harming the grid, it's harming our energy transition, it's, well, I won't go through all the critiques, it's raising prices, we can take our time with it. But what's the big thing that they're missing about how grids function?
Wow, that's a big question.
Sorry to lay that in your lap. But.
Yeah, I mean, there's obviously several critiques that people make about Bitcoin mining in the grid, and I will say some are valid, some are true. I mean, maybe they fumbled their way through them and they're not very precise, but some are true, some are obviously bad. I wanted to take some time today to kind of preface this and say that operating a grid is a Herculean task, right? It's an amazing feat of engineering to operate, also to plan, to forecast load growth and make sure that transmission lines and substations are built to be there. And grid operators are mandated with the reliability. This isn't really something that you can move fast and break, because millions of people depend on this. And so there's pretty much a do no harm mandate whenever making adjustments to the grid. And so grid operators go through this kind of like structured process for making changes. And over the past 10 years, this renewable transition, which everyone has an opinion about, but we can look and see that It's happening, whether you like it or not. The generators that are coming are wind and solar. And grid operators have been tasked with integrating these things into the system that already has this like do no harm mandate on how to operate it. And so whenever Bitcoin miners come in and say, oh, we're here with the solution to the grid's problem, we're going to put hundreds of megawatts that we can turn on with the flip of a switch. And it solves all the problems. And a grid operator just sits there and says, well, I see your thinking, but I can think of 100 ways where that's not the case. So I think giving some grace to the people that have to operate these systems and understand the complexity and work in it every day is something that we could do better on, and not just foisting Bitcoin mining as the solution. There are certain things that we can absolutely do, but I think that comes from partnerships like what Marty was saying with local utilities, trying to solve each other's problem in a good way, and not just coming online and not collaborating, not cooperating, and trying to do our own thing. Because ultimately, their mandate is reliability. And if they think that you're threatening that, they've got the end say. And I can't remember your original question.
No, this is good. Can we just go? This is better than my thing. Let's go down, push you a little bit farther. Give me your best, freak out about how mining could hurt grids.
Sure.
In ways that maybe you don't read in the New York Times. What should the New York Times have written about? What should their FUD be?
Anti-Bitcoin argument. So yeah. I think one of the main valid concerns is stability of the system, right? If you have, let's say, a 100 megawatt Bitcoin mine, which is huge, but it's by no means the largest that's on the system, right? That is 100 megawatts of load that has one critical path to failure. Right? Let's say the internet goes down, and your redundant internet connection doesn't flip, right? You just dropped 100 megawatts of load on a system. That is almost never been possible before, really, right? That amount of load is usually diversified over many different characteristics that can drop. And if you have a place that's under a constraint and you're consuming, and then all of a sudden you drop the load and that constraint exports more, that's a stability problem that grid operators are looking at, and they're saying, how do we solve this? There's issues like that are real, and it's frustrating for me to see some marginal emissions reporting that everyone argues over and spends time doing, and then in the background you've got grid operators and miners trying to solve this other problem, showing collaboration and things like that. So that would be my steel man, if you will.
Nice. And I'm going to follow this up with Marty. It seems like the problem of Bitcoin miners on the grid, flipping on or off, but independent of a utility or grid operator, and that threat to grid stability requires something like regulation, right? I've been looking from the perspective of this collective good, which is the grid. We have a threat coming onto it if it's a big enough load and it's completely outside the control of the grid operator. How do you think about this trade-off for miners? Because obviously, those kinds of regulations must involve the ability of someone else to keep the miner on or to turn them off under the right conditions to help the grid. And that's also going to be an attack vector. It's going to be a threat to the sovereignty of that mining operation that's on the grid. How do you think about that?
Yeah, it's one of the things. I heard something a couple months ago. I'm not sure if this is true. You may know this, and correct me if I'm wrong, but something there was never one data server farm that was the size of 50 megawatts 10 years ago. The largest data server farm in the country was less than 50 megawatts. Only a decade ago. Now, with Bitcoin mining, we're building multi-100 megawatt facilities, gigawatt facilities even, which is pretty unfathomable. So like you said, Troy, it could introduce some risk for the Bitcoin miner and for the grid to some level. Again, if that's one massive load coming on and off all at once, it's something that we need to get data on and really study and understand how it affects these things. And from a mining operation, that could bring the scrutiny of regulators on you and have them really looking at what you're doing and trying to work with you or force you to work a certain way to make sure that the grid is stable. And so that's something that's standard. It's not necessarily why we decided to employ the strategy we have, but it certainly is a factor, which is we target smaller operations. Again, these substations that we're working with in Appalachia are anywhere from 10 to 50 megawatts, and we're not consuming all that energy. And so from our perspective, it's, number one, it's quicker to build the infrastructure and get ASICs up and running, which is the name of the game. You get your machines, you want them plugged in as quickly as possible. And then we're more distributed, so as a mining operation, as an individual mining operation, the risk is distributed across many different operations instead of one massive mega mine. And then an added benefit of that is like we're less likely to get regulatory scrutiny. And this is not to say that I'm against mega mines or anything like that, but I do think the entrance of these massive operations, again, hundreds of megawatts, gigawatts even, now with Riot's new facility, is new for these grid systems. And it's something that we're going to have to figure out how it operates with the rest of the grid and residents using it.
Yeah, I want to turn to Guy. I'm thinking about, I guess, the question I asked to Blake. How do you think? What's the one thing that you wish people understood about how grids operate, and that would help to kind of close the divide that we have? Blake just kind of piled on with criticisms that the New York Times doesn't have but should. But what about the actual critiques that Bitcoin mining raises electricity prices, that it creates immense amounts of pollution? Apparently, the mines themselves create smog-filled skies. If you've seen the photos, there's photographic evidence that Rockdale is a smog-filled city.
It's terribly
But
breathe.
I mean, what are they not getting? Because they, I mean, to give the New York Times its due, they spent 6 months researching this story. They hired two separate. They hired two separate, respectable firms to do some research for them. One on emissions, and one on energy pricing in ERCOT, right? And yet we have that didn't. I don't think that convinced any Bitcoiners that Bitcoin really is raising prices broadly in electricity markets, or that it is a huge polluter. Who didn't already think that? Well, maybe you want to jump in, Blake, but I want to ask Guy first. I want to go to Guy first and then to you.
If I had to sum it up as quickly as possible, it would be the difference between looking at a static condition of the market or of the ecosystem and understanding the incentives and where it's going. It's really easy, concentration in a lot of different ways is always some sort of a risk, and it is always, you talk about, hundreds of megawatts. It's really easy to look at one situation in which they've responded to prices in this one particular part of the grid or near this one energy producer, and then make complaints about this, one thing and generalize it over the entire scope of the ecosystem. And it's also the one that people identify with more. You listen more to anecdotes than you do to data. People like a story, people like an example as a means to understand how to make sense of the world. Whereas when you look at the incentives, which I think is largely the reason why it's an ideological difference from a political standpoint, the political sphere is largely a appeal to everyone's emotion, tell them a story, and then this is how we get this bill passed for the people who need the subsidies and our special interests and stuff. But when you look at the incentives and kind of understand how things evolve, the energy incentives and the efficiency incentives of Bitcoin mining are unique in a way that is fascinating on multiple levels where we've never really had anything to solve this problem.
Well, spell it out.
Yeah, so a good example of this is probably generalized, and I've seen a couple of different reports, but the one that sticks in my mind was by the LNLL, and they made a report on the efficiency of the grid and how energy was used. And it has always stuck in my mind because like the grid itself, the idea that we're going to put all electricity now on the grid is actually a horribly efficient idea in and of itself because of the orchestration of trying to keep this thing running, is that a third of the energy on the grid is lost just because stuff is plugged in and it just leaks. A third of the energy produced on the grid, and this was done at like a multinational level that this analysis was done. A third of it is lost because the energy is produced when nobody's ready to consume it. And only a third is actually used. 2/3 in a generalized near global assessment, 2/3 of the energy that we create is just tossed in the trash for one form or reason or another. The crazy thing is that Bitcoin actually benefits from an incentive perspective, both of the 2/3 that we lose. One is that you don't have to transport the energy to find a user. You can transport the miner to where the energy is produced so that you can prevent energy that is lost from being dumped on the grid when it's not needed. You can literally plug miners directly into it. And then two, the energy that's produced when there's nobody around, it's the exact same problem and the exact same incentives is how do we get something to the energy producer when energy is free? There's nobody who will go hand over foot, crawl through mud to get something to plug in a miner into free energy as a Bitcoin miner. Like it's the only thing that can do it. You can't turn on a movie. You can't turn on a Netflix server for like just 30 minutes when you need it because your windmill is blowing right now. And then turn it back off and like have your Netflix go down and your customer's like, what the hell's going on? But you can do that with a miner. When you understand the incentives, like Bitcoin is literally it's behaving like an economic battery for the grid. And I think you put this on a long enough timeline and stop focusing on, you deal with the very specific scenarios and the concentration as they come up. Because that's what the market does. Problems arise and you fix them as they do. But if you have the incentives in line, well then you're able to make good decisions and you have the tools to actually correct those problems. And on a long enough time scale, Bitcoin finally begins to solve some of the major problems of the grid that we really haven't had a solution for that makes any economic sense before.
Yeah. You go, bud. I was just going to say, going back to what we were talking about earlier, markets, that's literally what Guy just described as Bitcoin creating a whole market. Markets are location-based a lot, and Bitcoin is location agnostic. Like Guy said, Bitcoin miners will crawl through shit to get to that cheap energy, and it's a beautiful thing.
Blake?
Yeah, I was going to go back to the, excuse me, the New York Times piece, as you were stating. You know, you said that they hired 2 experts. As someone that works in the power system field, the models, like every model that you run needs to be taken with a grain of salt, right? These are effectively deterministic models. You take inputs, they give you outputs, and these are models that they added load to and saw what the results were. So if you add demand to an economic system where it's a marginal bid, you will see a rising cost. Right, like in a model as simple as this, if you add demand, you will see emissions.
The model necessitates that.
The model necessitates that. That's what you will see. So you know, when I saw that, it's like, oh yeah, of course. Like what else would you see in a model? And
did you have to run it? You know?
Yeah. Well, yeah, exactly. You run it. There's a precision error, right? Like you got a specific result, and because you got a specific result, people also think that that's what actually happened. It's like, oh, miners created X tons of emissions. It's like, we don't know that's the case. We know that that was the result from the model run that they did, you know. But you know, the normal New York Times reader doesn't really care enough to look into it with that amount of nuance. They just see the result.
So I want to push you deeper on this because the model doesn't include any new generation. For instance, it does not, as far as I can tell, right? It doesn't include any new generation. So you're modeling one effect of Bitcoin mining, which is you add demand, but you don't increase supply of production, so you're going to get an increase in price. But you're not modeling the effects of Bitcoin on new generation. And when I've pushed people on this who are proponents of this way of thinking, they say, show me the PPAs. That's always their response.
It's hard, yeah. Well, they've never sat in a room and canceled a project because the economics didn't make sense.
It
will happen, which will happen.
I wonder if you can say, Blake, how the price signals from this increased demand, which are built into the model. I mean, that is the point of the model, is that price goes up with the demand.
That's right.
Okay, how does that incentivize generation? Because when I make this point, I always get miners are not signing enough long-term power purchase agreements.
That's right. Well, it's like the missing money problem of these renewable generation. They need dollars in like the spot market in order to be economical, right? Like they have to make money. And the great thing about Bitcoin mining is that it turns off when prices are high. It's non-firm load, and that's the worst problem of grids, right? Is that the grids have to have the capacity to meet the peak, but they have to pay for that throughout the entire profile of the system, right? So if you've got a mining load that's willing to eat all the cheap hours, but then turn off, that's exactly what you need. That's exactly what you need to raise the average cost when these solar and wind developers are running the numbers enough, but then still not be there. I've got a great quote that I pull all the time, is that mining is quantitative easing, but for grid capacity. It presents the grid capacity, and then it's off whenever you need it, which is exactly kind of part of the solution. I also wanted to say that the marginal emissions study was zonal in precision. So everyone in West Texas had the same marginal emissions. Everyone in South had the same marginal emission. And it's just like, come on.
Can we take one more second on what is marginal emissions accounting? What is weird about it?
Well, I mean, there's tons of things that are weird about it. It's not normal. I mean, basically what it does is it creates a hypothetical scenario, right? It takes one volume of emissions that are being produced in this exact moment, and then it takes your load out, and it runs the model again. And it says that delta is your marginal emissions, right? And that's it. Like if you didn't exist, right, this would be the delta. Right? Now, the interesting thing about that is that if you took anyone else off as well, that would be the same marginal emissions, right? It's like this selective attention type of thing.
Back to the idea of energy use in general.
Yeah, if you took and because this is zonal in precision, right? If you took anyone in West Texas and removed their load, it would also have resulted in the same marginal emissions reduction. Right? It's just a very interesting selective attention. I understand what they're trying to do. They're trying to get away from the RECs. Right? They're trying to move away from the REC. And everyone kind of has their own opinion on RECs. And they're trying to get a little more precise to say, even though you owned RECs, because you're here, this is now they're trying to more precisely assign emissions above the RECs, which,
I find the marginal emissions maddening because people don't understand what it is. It's the point you made, but also if we selectively attend to, first of all, Bitcoin mining and then dryers and then other users of electricity, and we add up each of those marginal emissions, it will vastly exceed the emissions of the entire grid.
Yeah.
Right? Because because the marginal provider of energy is the highest emitter. Right? So that's the one that comes off in all the models when you take the load away.
It's always the high end.
Right? So it's like that's maddening to me. Marty, I know you wanted to jump in.
This is the insanity of carbon accounting. It's very unproductive and doesn't lead to good outcomes. It's annoying. It adds compliance costs to companies too, which you have to worry about all these stupid things, marginal emissions, and scope 1, scope 2, scope 3. We're wasting a lot of time focusing on this. Again, be as efficient as possible. Don't pollute. Energy's good.
There's another difference between the perspective of the critics and a lot of Bitcoiners see problems with these methods of accounting and see efficiency as a better focus, right? We're back to norms again.
Yeah.
But there isn't a simple factual answer to the question about what is the emissions due to mining. Like when you dig into that, it's like, do you mean marginally? Do you mean like their percentage of the whole grid? I think that's hard for people even to grok or understand. Yeah. Well, thank you very much for coming. We're out of time. We could keep this conversation going all day. Thank our panelists, please.
Thank you, Miami, for the last 3 years in this amazing city. The whole world shut down, but Miami welcomed us with open arms. We want to show Bitcoin to the whole world. We are taking the conference on the road to set the stage for Bitcoin in a new city. Nashville. Bitcoin 2024 is coming to Nashville in Tennessee, a city that is known as a music and freedom city. Bitcoin 2024 in Nashville from July 25th to 27th.